He went to inspect the land he owned. He never expected to question the home he built. Ethan Caldwell rarely visited his private ranch without scheduling it weeks in advance. The Caldwell family farm, located just outside Aspen, Colorado, was designed as a seasonal retreat, wide open pastures, white wooden fences, and a restored barn converted into a luxury countryside estate. It was where his twin toddlers, Mason and Miles, spent part of their summers under the supervision of a nanny and minimal staff. The air there felt cleaner than Greenwich. The silence felt honest. That was the illusion he preferred. But that Thursday afternoon, Ethan arrived without notice. He had been reviewing quarterly reports when an uneasiness settled in his chest, an instinct he could not quantify. Victoria had extended her stay in New York for charity commitments, and the twins remained at the ranch. Normally, Ethan trusted the routine completely. Yet something compelled him to board his jet and fly west unannounced. When he stepped out of the SUV onto gravel and dust, the ranch looked peaceful. Sunlight stretched across acres of golden grass. Horses grazed near the far fence line. From a distance, he heard laughter. He followed the sound. What he saw stopped him mid-step. The cleaning lady, Elena Ramirez, the woman hired seasonally to maintain the ranch house, was sitting on the wooden porch steps. Mason and Miles were in front of her, their tiny hands covered in soil. They were not dressed in their usual designer outfits. Instead, they wore simple cotton shirts and denim overalls, smudged with dirt. Elena was guiding their small hands as they pressed seeds into the earth of a planter box. Ethan felt something close to shock. His twins were never allowed near soil without supervision. The nanny enforced strict hygiene routines. Organic meals, scheduled naps, structured learning activities. Dirt was considered risk. Disorder was discouraged. Yet here they were, laughing freely, smearing soil across their palms. Elena did not notice him immediately. She spoke gently in Spanish, explaining how seeds grow when given patience and care. Mason looked up at her with full attention. Miles clapped when she poured water over the soil. Ethan did not understand why his chest felt tight. Then Mason looked up and saw him. "Daddy," he shouted. Both boys ran toward him, their overalls dusty, their knees stained. Mason hugged his leg without hesitation, leaving a faint imprint of soil on his tailored trousers. Ethan remained still. Elena stood quickly, brushing her hands against her apron. "Mr. Caldwell, I didn't know you were coming," she said carefully. He stared at his sons. They were glowing. Not polished. Not curated. But alive in a way he hadn't seen in months. "Why are they dirty?" he asked quietly. The question carried more weight than volume. Elena hesitated. "They asked to plant with me. I supervised them the entire time. They washed their hands before lunch." "That's not the point," Ethan replied. But even as he said it, he realized he wasn't sure what the point was. The nanny appeared moments later, visibly anxious. She began apologizing immediately, explaining that she had stepped inside to prepare snacks. Elena had offered to keep the boys occupied for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Ethan looked down at Mason and Miles again. They were holding small plastic shovels like trophies. There was no fear in their eyes. No tension. Just joy. He felt something unfamiliar, disorientation. He had built this farm as a sanctuary. A place of structured freedom. But what he saw unsettled him because it didn't fit his controlled vision. The twins weren't just supervised. They were connected. Elena met his gaze calmly. "They wanted to know how things grow," she said. "I thought it would be good for them to see." Her tone carried no defiance. Only sincerity. Ethan nodded stiffly. "Clean them up." He turned toward the house before his voice revealed uncertainty. Inside the ranch kitchen, sunlight poured across rustic wood counters. He poured himself water and stood in silence. He told himself he was reacting to risk, liability, health standards. But deep down, something else disturbed him. His sons had looked more alive in those 10 minutes than during any curated activity he had paid for. And he didn't understand why that realization felt threatening. Outside, laughter resumed faintly. Ethan walked to the window and watched Elena gently wash their hands at the outdoor faucet. She wiped their faces carefully, speaking to them softly, as if they were her own. And for the first time, a thought entered his mind that he wasn't prepared to face. What if she was giving them something he never had? And what if that was the real reason he felt paralyzed? The next morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual, long before the ranch staff stirred and before the twins padded barefoot down the hallway in search of breakfast. The Colorado air felt colder than it had the previous afternoon, or perhaps it was simply that his thoughts had sharpened overnight. He replayed the image in his mind repeatedly, Mason and Miles kneeling in soil, laughing without restraint, Elena guiding their hands with patience instead of protocol. It unsettled him not because it was reckless, but because it was natural. And natural had never been the framework he trusted. He dressed quietly and stepped outside while the horizon was still pale. The field stretched wide and empty, mist hovering lightly above the grass. This ranch had always symbolized balance to him, controlled wilderness, curated authenticity. The horses were groomed meticulously. The barn had been renovated into a luxury guest house. Even the rustic kitchen had imported stone countertops. Everything here was designed to appear simple while remaining carefully managed. By the time the twins ran outside after breakfast, he was already waiting near the porch. They were excited to show him the small planter box from the day before. The soil was damp, tiny wooden markers labeling what they had planted. Mason proudly pointed at one stick labeled carrots in crooked handwriting Elena must have helped him trace. Miles clapped at the thought of something growing beneath the dirt. Ethan watched them crouch near the planter. Their hands hovered over the soil, not touching yet, simply observing. He noticed something subtle, patience. They were not demanding immediate results. They were waiting. That realization stirred something unexpected inside him. Elena approached from the kitchen carrying a bowl of cut fruit. She paused when she saw Ethan standing there, unsure whether to retreat or continue as usual. He surprised himself by nodding slightly, signaling her to stay. She knelt beside the twins and explained how seeds take time. How roots form before anything visible appears. The boys listened carefully, asking small questions about water and sunlight. Ethan felt the paralysis return, but it was different now. It was not anger. It was recognition. He realized his sons were learning something he had never intentionally taught them. Patience. Connection. Cause and effect beyond instant reward. Later that afternoon, he walked through the ranch house reviewing routines with the nanny. Structured learning schedules, language exposure programs, curated activities designed to optimize development. Every hour of the twins' day was documented. There was logic in it. Strategy. Yet when he compared that to the 10 unscripted minutes of planting seeds, something felt incomplete. That evening, while the sun dipped low over the fields, he found Elena alone near the barn. She was folding clean linens into a basket, her movement steady and unassuming. He approached her without announcing himself, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. "You've worked with children before?" he asked quietly. She looked up, surprised but composed. "Yes, sir. I helped raise my younger siblings." He nodded slowly. "You speak to them differently." Elena hesitated before answering. "I speak to them like they're capable." The words landed heavier than she intended. Ethan looked toward the house where Mason and Miles were chasing each other near the fence line. He had always believed capability was built through structure, through measured progress and carefully planned exposure. But what he saw yesterday suggested something else. Capability might also be built through trust. "They're not fragile," Elena continued carefully. "They're curious. Curious. The word echoed in his mind. He had protected his sons from risk, from discomfort, from unpredictability. In doing so, he had also shielded them from experience. Dirt could be washed away. Scraped knees could heal. But suppressed curiosity left quieter marks. That night, after the twins were asleep, Ethan walked through their room slowly. Their tiny boots sat near the door, faint traces of soil still in the grooves despite the nanny's efforts to clean them thoroughly. He picked one up and held it for a moment. He realized his paralysis the previous day had not come from seeing Elena treat his sons improperly. It had come from realizing she treated them as children, not investments. The next morning, he did something no one expected. He cancelled the structured afternoon enrichment session. Instead, he told the nanny to let the twins help in the garden again. When Elena heard the instruction, she looked at him carefully, searching for irony. There was none. The twins ran outside with excitement that needed no permission. Ethan stood on the porch watching them kneel in soil again, sunlight catching their hair as they laughed. This time, when Mason looked up and saw him, Ethan did not remain frozen. He stepped off the porch and walked toward them. And for the first time in a long time, he knelt down in the dirt beside his sons. The soil was cool in his hands. Real. Uncontrolled. Elena watched quietly from a distance. What Ethan did not yet understand was that this small shift would not remain contained within the ranch. It would follow him back to Greenwich. It would challenge the architecture of his parenting, his marriage, and even the way he defined legacy. Because sometimes the greatest threat to control is not rebellion. It is innocence allowed to breathe. Victoria returned to the ranch 3 days later, expecting the usual rhythm of controlled elegance. She stepped out of the car in tailored linen, sunglasses shielding her eyes from the bright Colorado sun, already prepared to inspect routines and reconnect with the twins through scheduled affection. But the moment she walked around the side of the house, she stopped. Mason and Miles were barefoot in the grass. Not unsupervised. Not neglected. Just barefoot. Ethan stood a few feet away, sleeves rolled up, watching them attempt to guide a small wooden wagon across uneven ground. Their laughter rose freely into the open air. Elena was near the barn hanging laundry, glancing over occasionally but not directing every movement. Victoria felt a tightening in her chest. This was not the image she left behind. She approached slowly, her heels sinking slightly into soil she would normally avoid. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. Ethan turned toward her with a calm she did not recognize. "They're exploring," he said simply. Victoria looked down at their feet, at the faint smudges on their knees, at the way their shirts were wrinkled from actual play rather than styled perfection. "They'll catch something," she replied automatically. "Like what?" Ethan asked gently. The question caught her off guard. She searched for a concrete answer: bacteria, injury, unpredictability, but none felt solid enough to justify the weight in her tone. "They're fine," he added. "I'm watching." That sentence unsettled her more than it should have. Watching had always meant managing. Now it seemed to mean allowing. Later that evening, once the twins were asleep, Victoria confronted him in the kitchen. The ranch lights were dimmed, casting warm shadows against reclaimed wood walls. "You've changed something," she said quietly. Ethan leaned against the counter, thoughtful rather than defensive. "Maybe I have." She crossed her arms, not out of anger but uncertainty. "We agreed on structure. On discipline. On raising them intentionally." "We are," he replied. "But intention doesn't have to mean control." The word lingered between them. Victoria had grown up in a world where perfection was armor. Presentation was protection. She believed shielding children from discomfort prepared them for excellence. Dirt felt symbolic of disorder, and disorder felt like risk. "They're learning patience," Ethan continued. "They're learning how things grow. How to wait." Victoria hesitated. That's what school is for. Ethan shook his head slightly. No. That's what life is for. Silence followed, heavy but not hostile. The next morning, Victoria observed from the upstairs balcony as the twins knelt near the planter again. Elena guided them gently but stepped back often, allowing space for curiosity. Mason misjudged his balance and tipped sideways into the grass. Instead of panic, he laughed. Miles attempted to pull him up and fell beside him. Both boys erupted into giggles. Victoria felt something unexpected, relief. There was no fear in their laughter. No anxiety about getting it wrong. They were not performing. They were discovering. She descended the stairs slowly and walked outside without announcing herself. The boys ran to her immediately, hands extended proudly to show tiny green shoots breaking through the soil. "Mommy, look!" Mason exclaimed. Victoria crouched down, ignoring the grass brushing against her expensive trousers. She looked closely at the fragile sprouts pushing upward. Something small and alive had emerged from the dirt. "When did these come up?" she asked. "Today," Miles replied proudly, though the word came out slightly slurred. Elena stood a few feet away, respectfully distant. Victoria glanced at her briefly, then back at the planter. "They did this themselves?" she asked. "With guidance," Elena answered softly. Victoria nodded. For the first time, she saw not a cleaning lady overstepping boundaries, but a woman offering patience without agenda. She realized her sons did not look smaller in the dirt. They looked braver. That afternoon, Victoria surprised herself by removing her shoes before stepping into the grass. The ground felt uneven and unfamiliar beneath her bare feet. Mason grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the planter. Ethan watched from the porch, recognizing the quiet shift unfolding. The paralysis he had felt days earlier had not been about Elena. It had been about fear. Fear that allowing imperfection might expose weakness. Fear that loosening control might diminish excellence. But watching Victoria kneel beside their sons, soil pressing gently against her palms, he understood something deeper: excellence without experience is fragile. That evening, as the family sat together on the porch watching the sunset stretch across open fields, the ranch felt different. Less curated. More alive. The twins leaned against their parents, tired from actual play rather than structured stimulation. Victoria broke the silence softly. "Maybe we've been preparing them for a world that doesn't exist." Ethan looked at her, understanding fully. The world they feared, messy, unpredictable, imperfect, was the world their children needed to navigate. Shielding them from it had not strengthened them. It had only delayed them. But what neither of them realized yet was that this transformation at the ranch would collide with resistance once they returned to Greenwich. The structure they had built there would not bend as easily as soil beneath small hands. And when that resistance surfaced, it would force them to choose between reputation and reality. When they returned to Greenwich, the shift they carried from the ranch did not blend quietly into their old life. The estate stood exactly as they had left it, white columns polished, hedges trimmed with geometric precision, marble floors reflecting chandelier light like disciplined mirrors. Nothing had changed on the surface. And yet, everything had. The twins ran through the foyer the moment they arrived, their boots slightly scuffed from weeks outdoors. The head nanny, Margaret, greeted them with professional warmth and immediate assessment. Within minutes she noticed subtle differences. The boys were louder. Freer. Less responsive to rigid instruction. When she asked them to sit properly at dinner, Mason questioned why it mattered if he finished his vegetables first. Miles attempted to explain how carrots grow before being served on plates. Their curiosity had expanded beyond the boundaries of obedience. Victoria watched carefully from the head of the table. The twins were not defiant. They were engaged. But Margaret's tightened posture revealed discomfort. The next morning, the structured schedule resumed: language immersion, early mathematics drills, supervised playtime within the indoor atrium. Yet Mason's attention drifted toward the garden visible through the tall glass windows. He asked if they could plant something there too. Margaret gently redirected him toward phonics exercises. Ethan observed quietly from his study balcony overlooking the atrium. The environment that once felt ideal now seemed airless. Later that afternoon, he called a meeting with Margaret and the household staff. His tone remained calm but decisive. "We're adjusting the routine," he explained. "Less indoor structuring. More outdoor exploration. Real experiences." Margaret hesitated. "With respect, Mr. Caldwell, early discipline shapes long-term success." Ethan met her gaze evenly. "So does confidence." The change unsettled the estate. Staff whispered about loosened expectations. The gardener was instructed to designate a small section of the back lawn as a planting area for the twins. The once purely ornamental landscape began to include something functional. Soil was turned. Wooden planter boxes were installed. Victoria felt the tension most strongly at social gatherings. When guests arrived for a weekend luncheon, the twins appeared with faint grass stains on their knees. Mason excitedly described how worms improve soil quality. A guest laughed lightly, calling it adorably rustic. Victoria sensed the judgment beneath the compliment. That evening, she confronted Ethan in their bedroom. "People are noticing," she said quietly. He looked up from removing his cufflinks. "Noticing what?" "That we're relaxing." He considered the word carefully. "Is that a problem?" She hesitated. The truth pressed gently at her conscience. "I don't want them to think we're careless." Ethan stepped closer. "We're not careless. We're present." The difference felt subtle but powerful. Over the next weeks, the twins' personalities expanded in ways neither parent expected. Mason began asking deeper questions about how things worked. Miles developed patience when tending to small sprouts in the backyard planter. They still attended lessons. They still learned structure. But now structure coexisted with experience. One afternoon, during a formal dinner event, Mason excused himself from the table politely and returned holding a small clay pot with a fragile green stem emerging from soil. He placed it beside Ethan's plate. "We grew this," he said proudly. The room fell silent for a moment. Ethan looked at the plant carefully before responding. "That's incredible," he said sincerely. A guest remarked that dirt had no place near fine china. Victoria felt the old reflex rise within her, the instinct to restore polish. But she caught herself. She looked at the small plant, then at her son's hopeful expression. "It belongs," she replied softly. That was the moment the shift solidified. The estate did not collapse under the weight of imperfection. It adapted. The planter boxes became conversation pieces rather than embarrassments. The twins balanced discipline with discovery. Even Margaret gradually adjusted, observing that the boys focused better after outdoor activity. Ethan realized that paralysis, the feeling that had first struck him on the ranch, had been rooted in fear of losing control. But control had not diminished. It had matured. One evening, as the family gathered in the backyard garden area beneath soft lantern light, Mason carefully watered the plants while Miles asked when they could harvest carrots again. Victoria sat beside Ethan, her hand resting gently on his. "I was afraid we were lowering standards," she admitted quietly. He smiled faintly. "We raised them." The legacy he once imagined, elite schools, flawless manners, curated achievements, now felt incomplete without resilience, curiosity, and grounded confidence. The twins were not becoming less prepared for the world. They were becoming more capable within it. And in that quiet realization, Ethan understood something essential. The cleaning lady at the ranch had not undermined his authority. She had reminded him what it meant to raise children who are not paralyzed by perfection. Sometimes the greatest strength is not built through control. It grows quietly in the soil, where small hands are allowed to get dirty and still feel safe. The crisis did not arrive with warning. It arrived on an ordinary afternoon, disguised as harmless confidence. Mason had insisted he could climb the low wooden fence near the back garden by himself. It was not tall. It was not dangerous. Under their new philosophy, small risks were allowed within reason. Ethan was only a few steps away when it happened. Mason's foot slipped against loose soil, and he fell awkwardly onto the grass below. The sound of impact was soft, but the silence that followed was not. Victoria's heart stopped before Mason even cried. She reached him first, panic flooding her voice as she examined his arm. Mason winced, tears filling his eyes, though he tried bravely not to sob. Ethan felt the old paralysis surge back into his chest, stronger than before. The fear was immediate and sharp. This was what he had tried to prevent. This was the risk. Within minutes, they were in the car heading toward the hospital. Victoria's thoughts spiraled rapidly. Had they been careless? Had they mistaken freedom for neglect? Had the dirt and climbing and unstructured exploration created vulnerability rather than strength? At the emergency room, doctors confirmed a minor fracture in Mason's wrist. Nothing severe. A clean break that would heal completely with proper care. The words should have calmed them, but Victoria's hands still trembled as she held her son. Mason sniffled quietly, embarrassed more than afraid. "I'm sorry, Mommy," he whispered. The apology broke something inside her. "You don't have to be sorry," she replied softly, brushing his hair back. For the first time, she understood that pain is not proof of failure. It is part of learning boundaries. Ethan stood near the window of the hospital room, staring out at the city skyline. The polished world he knew so well felt distant in that moment. He replayed the fall again and again, questioning his decisions. If they had kept the stricter structure, Mason would not have climbed alone. If they had enforced tighter supervision, perhaps this would not have happened. But then he remembered something Elena once said at the ranch. "They're not fragile. They're curious." Mason had not climbed recklessly. He had climbed because he believed he could. Because he trusted his ability. That trust did not disappear because he fell. When they returned home that evening, the estate felt heavier than usual. Margaret moved cautiously, as if waiting for blame to surface. Victoria carried Mason upstairs carefully, her expression softer than it had been in months. Miles stayed unusually quiet, watching his brother with concern. Later that night, after the twins were asleep, Victoria and Ethan sat together in the dimly lit living room. The fracture had shaken them, but something else lingered beneath the fear. "I was so scared," Victoria admitted quietly. "So was I," Ethan replied. She looked down at her hands. "Maybe we were wrong." Ethan paused before answering. "About what?" "About loosening control." He thought carefully. "If we had kept everything structured, he wouldn't have fallen today," he acknowledged. But he also wouldn't have tried. The truth settled between them slowly. Mason's fall had not erased the growth they had witnessed. It had simply reminded them that growth includes risk. There was a difference between danger and development. They had not abandoned supervision. They had allowed experience. The next morning, Mason insisted on going outside despite his cast. Victoria hesitated at first, but Ethan nodded gently. Miles helped his brother navigate the steps carefully. They walked toward the planter boxes, where small green shoots continued rising through the soil as if nothing had happened. Mason crouched carefully and examined the leaves. "They're still growing," he said proudly. Victoria watched from the porch, her fear replaced by something steadier. Strength was not built by avoiding falls. It was built by standing again. Ethan stepped beside her. "He'll remember this," he said softly. "Remember what?" she asked. "That he can try again." The estate did not become reckless. Boundaries were adjusted thoughtfully. The fence was reinforced. Supervision remained present. But the philosophy did not retreat into rigidity. In the days that followed, Mason adapted quickly. His cast became a temporary inconvenience, not a symbol of failure. He told guests proudly that he had climbed too high. The confidence in his voice did not diminish. Ethan realized something profound. The paralysis he once felt had come from fear of imperfection. Watching his son recover without losing curiosity proved that resilience mattered more than spotless control. Victoria exhaled slowly one evening as she watched both boys sit in the garden, discussing how to protect the plants from frost. Dirt remained under their fingernails. Laughter still filled the yard. The fall had not erased joy. It had strengthened it. The real test had not been whether their children would avoid pain. It had been whether they could face it without retreating into fear. And now, standing together beneath soft evening light, Ethan understood that legacy is not measured by how carefully you prevent every fall. It is measured by how confidently your children stand back up. In the weeks after Mason's fall, something quiet but permanent settled over the Caldwell estate. It was not fear, and it was not recklessness. It was balance. The cast on Mason's wrist became part of daily life, wrapped carefully in plastic during baths and signed by his brother in crooked marker. The fracture healed exactly as the doctors predicted. What lingered longer than the injury, however, was the clarity it brought. Ethan found himself standing in the backyard one evening, watching both boys examine the garden beds with focused seriousness. Miles was explaining frost to Mason with exaggerated authority, repeating words he had heard from the gardener. Mason, despite his cast, insisted on watering the plants one-handed. The soil was uneven. The grass imperfect. And yet the scene felt whole in a way the polished atrium inside the mansion never had. Victoria stepped outside quietly, wrapping a light sweater around her shoulders. She stood beside Ethan without speaking at first. The sunset cast long shadows across the lawn, turning everything golden. For a moment, neither of them thought about reputation, discipline, or curated futures. They thought about laughter. About scraped knees and healing bones. About small green shoots pushing through dirt because someone believed they would grow. I used to think protection meant preventing everything, Victoria said softly. Ethan nodded. So did I. She watched Mason attempt to balance carefully while Miles steadied him. But maybe protection means staying close enough to catch them when they fall. Ethan looked at her, recognizing the shift not just in their parenting but in their partnership. The ranch had planted the seed. The fall had tested it. Now something stronger had taken root. The following weekend, they returned to the farm in Colorado. This time, the visit was intentional. Elena greeted them at the porch, surprised but pleased. The field stretched open beneath a bright sky, unchanged and steady. Mason ran toward the planter box, cast still visible but movements confident. Miles followed closely behind. Ethan approached Elena quietly. He fell, he said simply. She glanced toward Mason, concern flickering across her face. He's fine, Ethan added. It was a small break. Elena nodded slowly. Falls teach balance. There was no judgment in her tone. Only understanding. Victoria knelt beside the planter, touching the soil lightly as she had once resisted doing. Tiny carrots had begun to emerge from the earth. Imperfect shapes. Uneven growth. But alive. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked alone along the fence line where he had once stood paralyzed watching dirt-stained designer fabric. The paralysis felt distant now. Not because risk had disappeared, but because fear no longer dictated every choice. He understood something clearly at last. His twins did not need a childhood polished to perfection. They needed room to explore under steady guidance. They needed parents willing to trade image for involvement. They needed resilience more than refinement. That evening, the family sat together on the porch as the sun dipped below the mountains. Mason rested his cast carefully on his lap. Miles leaned against Victoria's side. The air carried the scent of soil and grass, not marble and polish. Ethan looked at his sons and felt no hesitation, no tightening in his chest. Only certainty. He had once been paralyzed by the sight of dirt on tailored fabric. Now he saw it for what it was, a sign that his children were living, not performing. The legacy he once imagined, flawless manners, controlled outcomes, protected perfection, had evolved into something deeper. Courage. Curiosity. The confidence to fall and rise again. And as the last light faded across the open fields, Ethan understood that the greatest inheritance he could give his twins was not wealth or status. It was the freedom to grow, roots first, unseen beneath the surface, before ever reaching toward the light.